Okay.
Okay. 5 seconds late, so let's get cracking on. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Overview and Scrutiny Services meeting. Happy New Year to everybody. I would say it's good to be back, but it's been hard to get back to work after a Christmas off. But thank you for your attendance. Okay, so this is only got one item tonight, which we'll get to in a minute. Apologies and absence and substitutions.
Yeah, we have apologies. I've received apologies from Councillor Joan Heathen and Councillor Sally Dixon and Michaela Wicks are not here, so I will make a presumption that there is apologies from them.
Surprised they want to miss a meeting like this. So. Okay, any declarations of interest, Claire?
None received prior to the meeting.
Okay, so shall we get straight onto business then? So that's the Waverley AQAP 2022 and Clean Air Strategy. That's pages 5 to 68. So we've got two people talking on it. I think Richard is going to set the scene, and I think Claire's there to answer any difficult questions should they be. My plea to Richard earlier on today was to be concise and without getting too technical and confusing us, because hopefully everybody's read this document inside out. So, Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members. Thank you for agreeing to this extra meeting to consider this document. I'd like to introduce Claire Beattie, who's our air quality consultant, who's been doing a lot of the work on this with Jeanette, my colleague, to develop the air quality strategy for Waverley and further develop and refine the action plan that goes with it. I'm not going to say very much, just that we do have an improving air quality situation in Waverley, and we did only have some marginal exceedances in 2019. Obviously, a lot has changed since then in terms of behaviour. Volumes of traffic have reduced during COVID, and changes in people's working patterns since then has led to less commuting. And alongside that, obviously, nobody can fail to notice the increase in the number of electric vehicles running around in the Waverley Borough and the rest of Surrey, and also to realise that as time goes on, the more polluting older diesel vehicles and petrol vehicles are coming out of circulation, and newer, less polluting vehicles are taking their place. So lots of factors affecting where we're going with air quality in Waverley, but certainly it looks from a marginal exceedance position in the two air quality management areas we've got, the situation is improving year by year because of all of those other factors. But Claire is going to give you a brief presentation on the draft air quality strategy and the action plan that she's been developing with it. And then I'm sure we'll be able to answer your high-level questions in my part and the technical questions in Claire's part as we go forward. But I'll hand over to Claire, and I believe she'll share the screen and give you a presentation on the draft strategy and the action plan. Thank you, Claire.
Richard,
No worries.
Claire, can I just ask you, if you, as you go through it, if you want to refer to any of the pages, can you just give the people the page numbers, just so we can work along with you as well, if there's particular things you want us to look at? Thank you.
Okay, so what I've done is I'm going to provide just a little bit of context and background as to how and why the documents have been developed, and then a bit of content at the end. So I'm more than happy if people want me to clarify anything on the way. I'll try not to be too technical, but I will be just giving you a little bit, as I say, a bit of context, which will help you understand why there's two documents basically, and what pollutants we're covering. Apologies to those who may have seen many of these slides before, but I think it's important that everyone kind of understands where we're coming from. Right. I always have issues with sharing PowerPoint in Zoom in slide mode, so I'll carry on with it in this mode. Hopefully people can see enough of the screen. But yeah, and as I say, feel free to clarify any points as I go along. So just a little bit of policy background. So this is a statutory process under the original Environment Act, which was 1995, which was updated in 2021. So Waverley, along with all other local authorities, have a statutory responsibility to review air quality against some government set health-based air quality objectives, and health is what we're trying to improve at the end of the day. So yes, we're trying to improve air quality, but it all stems back to health. So there's a number of objectives being set over different averaging periods, which reflects the fact that these health effects happen over the short time periods as well as long, in terms of sort of long time periods. And because of that, the objectives apply at what we call relevant locations only. So for a long-term objective, which generally we measure over the period of a year, and that's the objective that you've had issues with in Waverley, as Richard said, up until 2019. They'll only apply at facades of residential buildings, and at schools and hospitals, and that's where people spend a good chunk of their time. Now, within the legislation, where those objectives aren't met, you are required to declare what's called an air quality management area. And where there's 2 air quality management areas in Waverley, and I'm going to come on to those. And you've then got a responsibility to put in place an action plan with measures to improve air quality in those particular locations. So those action plans focus on the particular pollutant for which the area has been declared.
Can I interrupt you a second?
Yeah.
When you talk about an action plan, this is a plan such that we meet government legislation. Is that correct?
It's a plan put in place locally where you've got an air quality management area that will then be reviewed by DEFRA and co, and there's guidance in place as to what that plan needs to include or needs to cover. And also there's actually sort of templates provided as to the actual format of that action plan. Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess not quite. I mean, it's not a plan that you're going to target. You can say at the end of the day, we have met government legislation.
So the aim of the action plan is to achieve the air quality objectives which are in legislation. But there's equally legislation requiring you to produce an air quality action plan to work towards those objectives.
Can I just come in with the chair's permission?
No, we want to keep to just the presentation, then the questions first, and then
just to clarify.
Steve, I want to keep us focused because people want to hear what Claire's presentation. I don't want us to get sidetracked.
Yeah, I just wanted to distinguish between the Clean Air Strategy and the Air Quality Action Plan, which are different documents.
I'm coming on to that. That's so quite a lot of you may have heard of the WHO guideline values. They're not in legislation as such, but they definitely provide a guide to sort of future political direction. So members of the public may come up with it, want to achieve those guideline values, but just to say, yeah, but they're not in legislation. They've been set at a very low concentration. And it's likely that we'll be working towards those values in the future. So this is the bit of the science bit, just to look at which pollutants are relevant. So these are health pollutants that have an impact on health. I put nitrogen dioxide first because that is the pollutant for which your air quality management areas are declared. Nitrogen dioxide has both long and short-term health effects.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, this is Sally Dixon. Hi. Sorry, it's taken me 10 minutes to get into the Zoom meeting.
Okay, welcome.
Can I just have a quick word with Peter, because I'm not going to be able to stay.
No, we're in the middle of a presentation.
Yes, I know, but I've now missed the beginning of the presentation because I'm trying to access it on Zoom. And I haven't had the papers for long enough to look at it because I still had family from Christmas.
Sally, we're not going to start again. You haven't really, you just missed a bit of the history. We keep
Okay.
stopping to get into the
Okay.
detail. So if
Yeah.
Claire carries on, please.
Can we just,
Okay.
can I just say, I think Jerry is on the line and he would
Right,
be.
Sally, we can't keep interrupting. It's, you know, we've got someone who's doing a formal presentation. It's quite rude. And we've had now 2 interruptions of the presentation. So
I know, but
we
the Zoom meeting
straight
has been
back to
badly
the
handled.
presentation and we'll
Yeah.
mute people.
I'm sorry, Kevin.
Muted.
Okay, so
I do apologise.
So for nitrogen dioxide, as I say, there's long and short-term health effects. The objective we're interested in Waverley, in common with most other local authorities, is a long-term objective. Dominant source of nitrogen dioxide is very much traffic, which makes reducing nitrogen dioxide much more straightforward than other pollutants. And concentrations of nitrogen dioxide reduce very rapidly away from roads. So if we just reflect back to the objectives only apply at locations that are relevant for the particular objective. So where you've got properties set back away from roads, concentrations of nitrogen dioxide tend to be below the objectives by that point. The other key pollutant is particulate matter, which are very small particles, measured by the size of those particles. So PM 2.5 are very small particles, less than 2.5 microns, that get right into the lungs and into the bloodstream. PM10 are slightly bigger particles, and there's objectives for both. The local air quality management statutory process covers PM10, but there's sort of absolutely growing health evidence practically by the day for PM 2.5, covering a massive range of health issues, not just respiratory and cardiovascular, cancer. There's a whole list of other emerging health issues, including kind of diabetes, increased risk of dementia, mental health issues, birth outcomes, etc. So particulate matter is becoming a much greater focus at government level as well as at local government level. Whereas up until now, the legislation has kind of pushed local authorities to looking at solely at nitrogen dioxide. So again, try and keep that in mind when we're thinking about the 2 separate documents. There's a much wider range of sources of particulate matter, and it's worth noting at this point, I think, that the move to electric vehicles, although will reduce direct emissions of which are the precursors for nitrogen dioxide, they won't reduce particulate matter as much because there's a relatively large contribution from brake and tyre wear, which can be greater for electric vehicles. So although you haven't got any particulates coming out of a tailpipe, they'll still have emissions of particulates. So just to bring it a bit locally, we've sort of said already there's been marginal exceedances up until 2019 in both AQMAs. So the AQMAs have been declared in Godalming and in Farnham, and I'll come on and just show you a quick map on the next 2 slides. So some of the issues that are relevant when we're thinking about measures to improve air quality, diesel's got a much higher NOx emissions than petrol vehicles. So NOx is the sort of precursor to nitrogen dioxide. Stop-start traffic in particular increases acceleration and therefore emissions. So we're trying to sort of reduce stop-starting, reduce congestion will improve air quality. Obviously, reducing numbers of vehicles will improve nitrogen dioxide, and using lower emission vehicles, particularly electric. But as I say, there are large reductions in nitrogen dioxide emissions through newer vehicles, even if they're still petrol and diesel. So as I say, nitrogen dioxide is the one where the air quality management areas have been declared. So for particulate matter in the size range of PM10, there's no exceedances of the air quality objectives in Waverley. As I said, there's a much wider range of sources. So just by tackling traffic, you won't get as big a reduction in PM10 or PM2.5. So the smaller particles, PM2.5, are becoming much more of a focus at government level, particularly through the new Environment Act. And as I've said, health effects evidence is kind of growing almost by the week. So in Godalming, we have fairly small scale AQMA on this hill, and largely driven by increased acceleration, I would suggest, going up the hill. But also pollutants don't disperse as rapidly where you've got kind of what we call a canyon, which in this case is caused by sort of the hedge on the right and the properties relatively close to the road on the left. But the actual exceedance was at the property with the sort of nearest to the road, so that it was fairly marginal. In Farnham, again, relatively small AQMA in the centre of Farnham. Again, sort of lack of dispersion of the pollution once it's been emitted, and yeah, just busy, congested, trafficked street. Really, I think that's the main issue. I should point out, from a health perspective, you'll still get health effects below air quality objectives. So we're very much in a situation where Waverley are now achieving government health-based objectives, but you'll still have health effects. Therefore, you still want to be improving air quality and improving emissions, reducing emissions, I should say. So that's where we're sort of balancing between your statutory objectives and reducing emissions more generally. And hence, we have put in place 2 documents to cover those 2 issues. So the Air Quality Action Plan specifically covers nitrogen dioxide within the AQMAs. It needs to follow a DEFRA template and be sent to DEFRA for review. Needs to be proportionate to the air quality issues within the AQMAs, which, as we've discussed, are improving. But not to sit back on your laurels and sort of think, right, well, that's all sorted. As I say, there are still health effects below those objective levels. So we've also written a clean air strategy and consulted on a clean air strategy, which it can provide a much more flexible approach because there's no sort of specific government approach. It covers both nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter, which is great because the greater health evidence is relating to particulate matter. And it's likely that air quality strategies will become a much, they will become a requirement for local authorities without AQMAs from 2023. But I think they'll become a much more used vehicle for sort of improving air quality locally. So in Waverley, as part of that, is kind of ahead of the game. So that was another reason for wanting a strategy as well as the action plan. Okay, so you have been sent both documents, I think, prior to the meeting. Just to outline what measures we've put in both, really. So as I say, for the Air Quality Action Plan, we've tried to be quite focused on those particular locations that I've just shown you. We've been having discussions particularly with Surrey County Council, because these are very much traffic related. Nitrogen dioxide is very much a traffic related pollutant. So particularly discussions around the Farnham infrastructure programme, the implementation of the Quick Wins project within that programme, looking at implementing the Farnham local cycling and walking infrastructure plan, encouragement of electric vehicles, particularly through infrastructure, not just private vehicles, but including buses and taxis. And then we have included slightly more general, a couple of general measures which should reduce emissions more generally across, but including in the AQMA. So a kind of consistent use of the planning system to prevent creep of increased emissions into the future, and also the implementation of the Waverley Clean Air Strategy to sort of get that embedded in the action plan. Godalming, there's much sort of fewer specific measures we can do because of the location. So we've reiterated about encouraging electric vehicles, which will help nitrogen dioxide, and again, consistent use of the planning system and implementation of the clean air strategy. Okay, so moving on to the clean air strategy. That's been designed to be a much more of a public friendly document. As I say, the action plan has to be in sort of the template that DEFRA provides. So this is I think a much easier to read document with some wide ranging measures. And the structure we've adopted for the consultation is to provide 16 priority actions, and they're fairly generalized. I've listed them there. Don't worry if you can't read them all, but they're kind of quite general, like promoting walking and cycling, influencing others to improve air quality, kind of raising awareness, those sorts of priority general actions. And the reason for that is that the document recognises that Waverley Borough Council on their own can't do everything to improve air quality. It needs to definitely work. You need to be working collaboratively with others at lots of levels of government, plus other organisations. So in this way, we have hopefully provided a kind of format within which other organisations can come up with their own specific actions within those kind of priority actions. So really designed to encourage others to take action and not just Waverley. But what we've then gone on to do is specify some Waverley Borough Council commitments in a table, including kind of who will deliver it, key performance measures, timescales. So we've got 3 key groups of measures. So providing leadership in improving air quality, working collaboratively, and supporting and enabling behaviour change. As I say, we've got 32 commitments over those key groups of measures. This, which I haven't listed because I thought that was too much to kind of list out, but they're all within the document. We've also identified some constraints to implementing some of these particular commitments and some of the governance that will be hopefully in place to deliver both the strategy and it will largely cover the action plan as well. So just to finish up, these are just examples of the sorts of commitments that Waverley have, or if the document gets adopted in this form, Waverley would sign up to. So under leadership, things like developing plans to reduce emissions from travel through the Waverley Borough Council fleet, supporting ongoing work regarding kind of renewable energy generation projects, working collaboratively with parish and town councils, with Surrey County Council, public health and transport teams, supporting enabling behaviour change around, it may be around developing projects to raise awareness about solid fuel burning, promoting and enforcing changes to in supplying and buying local fuel, adopting local cycling and walking infrastructure plans. So as I say, these measures don't just incorporate traffic related measures, they're much more wide ranging, including a much wider range of sources, which for particulate matter will include things like solid fuel burning, but also energy generation and other sort of combustion sources, as well as traffic. So we've tried to sort of incorporate a much wider range of measures. That's where I wanted to get to and open up for discussion and any questions.
Thank you very much, Claire. I've probably just got one point and then I'll throw it open just so I don't forget my point. The Waverley Borough's commitments, the timescale says either short to medium, long. Normally we have a sort of date. and it makes it easier then to track on future meetings what actions are outstanding. So I just wondered why we'd used short to medium, medium to long, that type of terminology, and what does it actually mean?
There's
Short mean up to 6 months, so we can put a date on it. It's just really
Yeah.
our role for scrutiny is to track things in the future, and in
There's
6 months' time, I won't know whether in the short or the medium.
There's a footnote at the bottom of the table. I'm afraid I haven't got the strategy or the action plan in the format that you've been sent. So it's page 22 of the strategy. If you, I don't know what page it is in your, which basically says short term in the next financial year, medium term up to 2024, long term 2025 onwards. So, but I mean, these sorts of details, if there's a sort of standard Waverley Borough Council way of describing short, medium, we can adopt different timescales for that, for those.
I just think the document, that footnote which I've missed, in 6 months' time you probably won't know where the footnote is. It should either be the very start or on each one by 31st of March 2024. It's just changing it. Then you've got a specific date and you can see it straight away. That was my only point. So that would be really, really good. Okay, members, over. Councillor Reid.
Thank you very much, Claire. I've read the document from front to back and dived into it several times. I think these are very nebulous in that there are so many other people that have to be involved. It's very difficult to know where Waverley could concentrate or make a mark. For instance, there's a list at the very beginning of this document of all the people that have been involved. I'm not saying they shouldn't have been. I think everyone should be involved. It's a very big issue. But as our chair says, Councillor Denis, how are we going to control it? And we have to review this every 5 years. It's just, and the other point I wanted to make is, we've got a lot of people making comments, and it's all, again, very nebulous in that we've got to raise awareness. Now, how are we going to do this? Where's the funding coming from? How many of the numerous people are going to be involved in it? It's all very well to have very good ideas, and we all support them, and a lot of us around this table and watching online are in the group that are looking for climate change and how we can change the way of the world so that everyone is living a more healthy life. It's just, how are we going to do this? Who is going to make that final decision? Those are my questions, basically.
Okay.
Thank you.
Richard, do you want to give a Waverley?
Yes, I mean, in terms of how will this happen? This report will obviously go on to the executive from here on, with feedback from the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and it will be for the executive to determine how if at all, these actions will be funded. The executive will have to make provision within the budget to deliver the action plan if it's signed off by the executive. And it will be monitored by the Climate Emergency Board and the executive as it progresses forward.
I'd just like to say that how much of this money is coming from the DEFRA grant? And does it go to Surrey, or does it come to us or other partners? Thank you.
Okay, Richard.
I'm not sure
I
DEFRA
think
grant
I might.
you're referring to. Claire, do you want to?
I think I might be able to answer that, maybe not specifically. So the DEFRA grant covers purely projects that relate to air quality action plans and or PM 2.5 reductions. At the moment, DEFRA basically put out a tender each year, so that can change over the years, but generally speaking, they relate to measures to reduce both of the pollutants that I've been talking about. In terms of Waverley, my understanding is that you have bid as part of Surrey, being led by Surrey County Council. So that wouldn't specifically, I think the last grant was around schools projects. So that would all feed into the strategy in particular, and potentially the action plan. But it's not been bid directly as, you know, we want some money for the action plan. It's more around projects that will help reduce emissions and help improve air quality.
Thank you.
Okay, Richard, did you want to come back? I see your hands up.
Yeah, it was just to make that point that we have two grants. We had a grant to support work around schools and encouraging parents to walk to school with their children, that sort of thing. More recently, we've got a grant for promoting the use of electric taxis. A very specific grant that several Surrey authorities applied for together to help encourage the taxi trade to switch to electric vehicles. There are no other DEFRA grants approved for Waverley at the moment, and it is up to us and other Surrey authorities to apply for DEFRA grants each year when they offer funding for grant-aided activities. So there's no guarantee of any DEFRA grant funding into the future. We'll just have to seize the opportunity when they make the offers and invite people to bid for grants. Alongside that, of course, as I said just now, the council will have to consider how it's going to fund these actions if it's going to sign off the action plan.
Richard, can I just, you said earlier on this will go back to eventually the Climate Emergency Board. So what will the role of scrutiny be? Because, you know, scrutiny is about scrutinising performance and everything else. So it seems to come to us and then divert somewhere else. And I'm not sure, this may be past all of our time in term, but I'm thinking sort of it 23 into 24, the short term will need to be scrutinised. And I just wondered why it's not planned to come back to this committee.
I'm sorry if I sort of ignored that, but I didn't mean that overview and scrutiny hasn't got a role in this, but routinely the Climate Emergency Board will monitor it on behalf of the executive. And there will be an annual update which will be brought back to the overview and scrutiny as well as to the executive. So there will be opportunities for the overview and scrutiny to scrutinise this alongside the executive and the Climate Emergency Board.
I feel satisfied and relieved on that. Thank you. Councillor Munro.
I think, sorry, can I just, I don't think we've responded to your first point about the depth of people and organisations that have been involved and how do we kind of keep those on board into the future. I would suggest potentially, so we've basically had a steering group going. We've had some really good interaction with particularly Surrey County Council, but a wealth of others. You could try and keep that steering group going on a less frequent basis, just to keep up to date with what everyone else is doing and try and keep that momentum moving forward. That would be a suggestion as to how you could take that element forward.
Okay, thank you for that. David.
Thank you very much indeed for that. I think this is a very worthy document or pair of documents, and I do mean that as a compliment. It's nice to see that air quality and clean air has gone way up the agenda as it has done nationally, and I'm certainly in favour of doing it even more. I mean, but the fact remains is, apart from a few very selective areas, there's precious little Waverley by itself can do, because it has zero statutory instruments actually to force change, should we want to do that. I just sort of can't help feeling we're falling between two stools here, really. We're investing a lot of money and almost political capital in getting this thing off the ground, and I approve of that. I'm not suggesting we do nothing, but yet we seem to stop at the final hurdle, which is actually getting some teeth into this. For instance, bonfires. around where I live, bonfires are very much loved. They're part of our way of life. You get bonfires all over the place for good reasons, and I don't think it's gone into people's consciousness in the same way as everybody knows that cars pollute and we need to move to electric vehicles and all the rest of it. But I don't think people are. Well, they're still going to burn things in their gardens and parks. And if we're serious about this, then we ought to be devising some quite specific actions, which may be extremely unpopular, of actually trying to reduce things like bonfires. And I just use that as an example. So I think Waverley, if it has the political will to do so, and I'm not sure whether it does, especially at this rather sensitive time, then it really ought to throw all its considerable moral authority and be prepared to spend some money, or at least put it into the budget process, actually to persuade people to really take this clean air subject seriously. And I don't get an impression from this document that that's what Waverley are going to do. And it's not a job of our advisors. This is absolutely at the heart of what members should be saying, or not saying, as the case may be. It's a choice.
And I think that's a point we can make with our feedback. I think you're absolutely right. And throughout my working life, I've seen so many strategies. 99% of them actually achieve nothing. They're just a very nice, constructed document, and we want something that actually makes a difference. So I think we can certainly feed that back. Councillor Coburn.
I really just wanted to agree with Councillor Monroe. I mean, we have a statutory duty to do the air quality action plan, and I don't know how many I've sat through, and we sign them off and then they go away. And you're right, we have very little power to do anything. I mean, we have to do, as Claire has already said, we have to go by the template, do all the ticks, send it off, get DEFRA, and then really we almost forget about it till the next round. With the strategy, we have a slightly different issue here. We can actually, as you say, put in some more definite aims in what we want to achieve, because with the air quality action plan, we can sort of recommend, we can really put it out to, it's usually Surrey that we sort of send it to, because obviously it's usually linked to transport. So I think, you're absolutely right. The action plan's fine, we've got to do it, and we've done that. I think it's more the strategy that we have to really perhaps home in on to get some specifics. But you're right, as it stands, and I think Claire admitted this, it's a very general, let's make the world a better place sort of document, which we'd all agree. But unless, as Councillor Monroe said, unless you actually specifically have a plan, how on earth do you actually do it? And our problem would be, I think, that we don't have a statutory duty to impose very much at all. It will have to be the persuasion. And I have to say, and I've said it in the council chamber before, I don't like telling people how to behave. I mean, it just goes against the grain. You think as a teacher, I know, but it's something I don't like to do. I think you take people with you, you don't tell them what to do. I think it's the hardest thing in the world to get it right. But I think that's what we have to achieve. If we really want this to be something more than some just, we can say, hot air, that's an unfortunate phrase, what we're discussing. So I agree totally. But I think the action plan, I don't do much about it at all. It's statutory, it's got a template, it's been done.
That's a process we've got to do it, and it's about what teeth we put into the strategy to make a difference. So I think we can very strongly make that point. Peter, you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think, echoing David's comments, I think this is a good report in the way it's produced. I think Claire did a good job there, and I like the fact you've got the notes at the bottom of the pages with the references to the comments you've made. I think that's very professional. The strategy document, again, I think that's the way forward. Focuses on what strategy we're going to adopt. And there are one or two issues in there which I take exception to in the detail, and that's nothing that you've put together yourself, but things like the funding proposed to support the EV car charging, as an example. I don't see where the justification for any guess of what the number should be, or even whether it's necessary. I mean, I'm an EV car driver, so I'm speaking to some experience of what my approach would be. And I don't know whether you've asked other EV car drivers, or if the system has asked other EV car drivers what their requirements would be. So again, a justification for that part of the document. You do it in the main document, yes, for the action plan, but the strategy, I think, should have some teeth behind it, justify where we're going with the particular strategy items. Now, on the action plan, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I know what Carol said. We've seen this document a number of times. I don't know how long it's been going for. To my mind, it's not really a plan, an action plan, because if we are proposing this should satisfy legislation, I don't see how you can do it. I know it's a difficult problem. It's a lot of ifs and buts and all the rest of it. But I'm sure there must be a better way of trying to address that question. The air quality measurements, for example, you haven't addressed the uncertainty in those measurements in the document. That, to me, from a scientific point of view, would be a big issue. What is the uncertainty level you're working with? I mean, at the moment, you quote very small departures from what we're trying to achieve. To my mind, that's well within the uncertainty. So, if we've got, say, a plus or minus 50% uncertainty, why are we worrying about 5%?
Because we have to.
We might well say it. You can't prove that you're going to achieve 5% if you've got such an uncertainty. It's just how the data, how you manage and look at the meaning of the data. So it's the measurement part, to my mind, it's a critical issue that all this is based on.
Yeah, I mean, the measurements are largely treated in the annual status report, which is your annual reporting to DEFRA, where you basically report on the last calendar year of monitoring. The uncertainty issue, and I can certainly put something into the action plan if that's what people want. The uncertainty issue is normally treated as a sort of plus or minus 10%. So you would not, if you're looking to revoke air quality management areas, you would normally want at least a couple of years below 36. So the objective set at 40, so that gives you a 10% leeway. So I mean, we can put in something about uncertainty of measurements.
Well,
but I don't think it. I think that the action plan is designed to focus on the measures, which is what how we've taken that forward.
I mean, I think I'm getting at the point there that the data, the measurements you make with the diffusion tubes, they're in specific locations. How does that relate to the actual air quality that people are going to breathe? And like you say, year on year, you might have to look at the differences, and that gives you some idea of the yearly variability. But it still doesn't actually tell you what the air quality actually is in any particular year on average. And there's a big difference anyway between, say, summer and winter measurements if you looked at data in that more detail. We used to have a device in the Morby. Is that still operating? Do you know? That was not sure whether it was a real-time measurement system, but it was there for a long time.
I can't remember if it's still there. Apologies.
Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the objectives are based on an annual average, so it will take into account those fluctuations between winter and summer. And you're completely right. I mean, you can see those fluctuations in diffusion tube measurements. The diffusion tubes measure over the period of a month and then are annualized and adjusted according to various sort of laboratory bias, etc. Real-time analyzers will give you more information about fluctuations over the day, year, hour. But I'm not sure that will really impact what measures you would put in place.
And then I think the only way, it wouldn't be the definitive way, but the only way you might get some measure on a year-to-year, or not, I shouldn't say year-to-year, but you compare two systems, let's say the traffic management system as is now, and the traffic management system, let's say, might become the farm and infrastructure project. You need traffic modelling to give you the differences in traffic densities in these different locations. So that will give you a better view.
Yeah, this has been an ongoing point of discussion in the steering groups, and we've been pushing and pushing for them to do not only a traffic modelling, but air quality modelling as part of the Farnham Infrastructure Programme in terms of the decision-making process. That's exactly, you've hit the nail on the head.
So that to me would be a key part of saying this.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got.
We've been trying hard.
Yeah, thank you. I've got Richard and then Mary.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure it's. I think we've gone beyond it now. But in terms of action against bonfires, we do, of course, have legislation in place, smoke nuisance legislation, which can be used to tackle bonfire issues. But it is quite old legislation, and it's not got real teeth in it, because you have to prove a nuisance from the smoke, not the actual burning, and there's no prescriptive levels in there. But there is newer legislation now to control wood burners and log burners in homes. So the government is starting to focus on those sorts of emissions to atmosphere as well, but it's very early days. I think the other thing to bear in mind is the contribution that those sources of pollution to the air make to the overall picture. And there's no doubt that pollution from traffic is a much more significant contributor to pollution than bonfires and log burners at home. But it's certainly right, it is something we need to tackle. We need perhaps to get the government to strengthen the powers we've got in respect of bonfires even further.
We have got bonfires under support and enable behaviour change in the strategy, with a commitment from Waverley to encourage, basically to provide sort of raise public awareness around bonfires. If you want to go stronger, I fully, but again, we come back to the funding and the implementation.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that because David put his hand up. So I've just looked at it. We've got Mary next, Philip, and then back to David.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Richard. Starting this debate off was Councillor Reid, and I think she made some very valid points, and some of the comments she made that sort of highlights everything that's been said since that. The action plan is a document that we have to fulfil our statutory obligation to it. So I agree entirely. It's very much a tick box scenario where our hands are tied by a lot of what's in there, because we are just being governed by what we're supposed to be doing by our statutory commitment. But I think what we can do is we can actually focus on the Clean Air Plan, which is where I think we can start to put meat actually on the bones. But in order to deliver that, like Councillor Reid said, we need to know where the money's coming from and all the rest of it, and how we're going to actually implement it. And I think Claire was absolutely right, and I read the report with enormous interest, because some parts of this report is just based on, and I think, as you quite rightly said, Peter, there's lots of information at the bottom here, which is information and science-based facts that we can rely on. But I think when we come to an action plan, stuff like the steering plan, when we come to a clean air plan, stuff like steering groups and subgroups going forward and task groups are the way to really nail this thing down. And I absolutely agree with Carol Coburn as well. It's, we don't like to be telling people what they can and can't do, but we really do have to start to educate our residents more in actually hammering home the point that bonfires aren't nice. And we've got an issue in Cranley at the moment with the Thames Water, where they're discharging, where we've got sewerage floating on top of the streets at the moment. I mean, that's got to be something we can deal with through the planning process, or actually making Thames Water a statutory body that we make demands on them and penalise them and get perhaps fining them, and some of that money comes back to us to help fund some of these projects here. So I think all in all, I think it's a great piece of work. The action plan, we can do very little bit except a ticket, we've done it. But the clean air thing, I think we can do an awful lot. And I think the way forward is to use the steering groups and to break it down into task groups, and to actually have, through our comms, where we're regularly talking to our residents about how the importance, and we're never going to change people's attitudes, but at least we can't be damned for trying. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Philip.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for this report. I found it very interesting me going into a bit of detail though, and it's possibly following on from Ruth and what David has been commenting about, is do we know where we are now outside of traffic as to who is cycling, who is walking to schools, to know that if we've actually had some achievement in our communications, so we can use those communications then to take them into the other towns and parishes around the borough.
It's a very good point. As part of the local transport plan, which is obviously at Surrey level, they will collate lots of information about levels of cycling around the whole of Surrey. I haven't got details with me at the moment, but that's definitely, we need to think about how we're going to measure change, and measuring changes in behaviour as part of the success or otherwise of the strategy is actually a better way forward than actually through air quality monitoring. I say that purely as an air quality consultant, purely because the air quality monitoring itself will be influenced by lots of other factors, not least the weather.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
David?
No, I think I've done. Thank you.
Chairman, can I just ask something?
Yeah, and then we'll go to Martin afterwards. Yeah.
Just following on from what you just said there, which I think again is very relevant. In the action plan and in the report and the executive summary, it talks a lot about the illnesses that we can encounter as a result of pollution, heart and cancer and various other things. Is there any way of measuring that in terms of Waverley through our clinicians, through our partners in all of this? Because it says on the one hand that we have relatively good air quality and it causes these diseases, but is there any evidence to suggest what percentage of this population? It's a big ask, isn't it?
Don't
Yeah.
think you'll ever find a medic that can actually
Well,
confirm or
I
deny it.
think you can ask Ruth Hutchinson from Public Health, because they do lots of health.
I was going to say you can. So you can look at hospital admissions for certain respiratory diseases, and they're broken down into, they sort of give them codes, so you can basically get data. But what's the difficult bit is then correlating that with air quality, because as I say, there's lots of influences on health and on air quality. So yes and no, there are data that you can collect on things like, as I say, respiratory admissions, deaths, not deaths due to air quality, but deaths generally. Yeah, and public health are the people to speak to.
No, thank you. I think that's where it's important, because it highlights as an issue, but then it downgrades this by saying we can't correlate it to specifically that. If we could, it would put a different taint on it. But it's a good point about the public health.
And there's a difference between rural and urban areas for things like that. They do split health data down, right down to ward area. So I'm sure that could be looked at.
It says in the report as well that there's some areas that are more impacted than others. Why? Why? And do we need to look at a bigger scope in terms of, is it just emissions from cars? So it's a much bigger picture than we've got in front of us here.
But I think, again, we can put that as a recommendation that maybe Richard or Claire, the team, actually speak to public health, Ruth Hutchinson, to see whether they can do, maybe can they do a piece of work to see whether that helps us.
Good evidence-based support to the action plan.
Okay, that's
Thank you.
Martin.
I wanted to ask specifically about the PM 2.5 part of the equation, because I completely understand about the transport side of things with nitrogen dioxide, etc. Obviously, it's obvious where that comes from. And similarly, some of the 2.5, which is like tyre wear and brake wear, that's all understandable. But what I didn't really get my head around was there's a graph, there's a pie chart, I think it's on page 9 of the cleaning strategy, which shows the average background mean PM 2.5 in Waverley. And if you look at that, only 10% is from transport. So 50% is from, or even 51%, is from domestic. And is that what's that? Is that smoke? I mean, is that only smoke?
These figures are based on there's a national atmospheric emissions inventory, but this is Waverley figures, so they're quite high level, top down. The domestic side is generally solid fuel burning and some emissions from standard boilers, but yeah, if you look at the figures for PM 2.5, there's actually a massive contribution from solid fuel burning.
Okay. And then the orange bit, which is 39% of it, is from industry / agriculture / commercial. It seems a huge range of possible sources. So
yeah. So that's all sorts of, as I say, although you may not think of Waverley as very industrial, PM 2.5 also travels distances. So some of the PM 2.5 in Waverley may not have originated from Waverley. That's the other issue about trying to reduce PM 2.5 concentrations. So that will be maybe, I mean, if you get sort of from agriculture, wind-borne soil dust, etc., some of that will be PM 2.5. Not all of it. Some of it will be much larger particles. Yeah, there's just we sort of aggregated it to make it easier to understand. But as I say, the figures are from a kind of national look at emissions, which are then brought down to local level and provided for the whole country. So not necessarily your most robust data collection, but it's very difficult to do it from the bottom up, if that makes sense, and not something that local authorities are asked to do.
Yeah, the reason I'm sort of asking about it is that it says that the Environment Act will result in additional targets for PM 2.5, but it appears that we don't monitor it, and there's a reason, because we haven't needed to monitor it.
Yeah.
However, presumably we will need to start doing that at some point.
At some point, it's so DEFRA have released the targets in the last week, so they haven't been adopted by government yet. They're very long-term targets, so there's a target for an annual mean in 2040 at the moment. Then there's also a target for what's termed exposure reduction, so that'll be looking at just sort of background levels of PM 2.5. At the moment, they haven't issued any guidance as to what that actually means in terms of requirements for local authorities. It won't be, my understanding is it's not going to be a local target, but the amount of monitoring of PM 2.5 is absolutely going to increase. At the moment, there's not funding for that. DEFRA have increased their sort of automatic, so their national monitoring network to increase the number of PM 2.5, but I don't think by enough yet. So it's still a kind of watching brief as to what your requirements are likely to be. It may be that, yeah, they require strategies. It may be that they require reporting annually or none of those things. So yeah, PM 2.5 is also much trickier to monitor than nitrogen dioxide scientifically, and also more expensive. Just depressing, yeah.
Yeah. Happy New Year as well.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, to me, I think the work is really good, and I think the consensus around the table is the clean air strategy lacks teeth. And needs to be more direct. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? And everything else. And I think that's probably the biggest summary I can give of that document. It reads really well, but I can't see what we're actually going to do to make the difference. Ruth, do you want to?
There's a great emphasis from the whole of this meeting on raising public awareness
Yeah.
from every single person, I think, who's spoken, and that needs money. And it's almost like a campaign, as it was for, you know, wear your seatbelt or stop smoking. It is a huge campaign. It's a huge task for one local authority to put on, to take up. And the other thing is planning and infrastructure, which is on page 14 of 24 or page 58 of the whole document under actions. So, you know, and I know Councillor Darcy's mentioned planning, why aren't we insisting on certain things like the boilers, for instance, and all these things are going into the atmosphere. It's not as if we haven't mentioned it, and maybe we could in some small way go into the planning issues as Councillor Darcy has said. You know, we could maybe put an emphasis on that as our part, but this public awareness is not just Waverley, it's everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
Carol?
Well, just following on from Councillor Reid, there's a huge amount of work going on at the moment on Facebook, sort of against local issues. Bonfires has been one that's been very sort of current, I think it still is. And you're right, you know, ultimately, when they brought in seatbelts, we all thought, don't be daft, we're not going to wear one of those. Now, I mean, you wouldn't leave home without automatically putting it on, smoking in restaurants, all these things. But it does take time, and it also takes a real focus, because if you put people off at the beginning, you've then got to sort of get them back round, haven't you? But you're absolutely right. You can get a good focus, get some good comms cheaply. Well, I say cheaply, but you know what I mean. Something that's going to be cost effective. Then I think we could really sort of change people's behaviour. But we're not unique by any stretch. I mean, what's going on, as I say, on social media at the moment is really quite effective.
How are you getting on capturing these
I
issues?
think I've got most of it.
I always think it's a good idea that when you've captured them, that you just stick them in an email,
Yes.
ping them around,
Yeah.
because you know we all interpret
Yeah.
comments, and I think it's been some really good points. And I'd hate for us to put it in, dilute it, or something like that. So we'll make sure those go out. But the only thing I would ask is a fairly quick turnaround. Councillor Darcy.
Yeah, just wanted to, I don't want to bang on about the PM 2.5 because I understand the issue, but at the moment there's a drive, a lot of people are getting solid fuel wood burners because of the cost of living problem, and because it's perceived as, you know, we live in a wooded county, getting hold of wood, some people, it's quite easy for some people to get cheap supplies. Now, if this is an issue, if it's going to develop and grow and there's more and more smoke, then we need to have some measure, don't we? We need some way of being able to quantify what the current problem is and how it might increase. But at the moment, we don't seem to be able to do that. So I don't really understand how we're going to address trying to do something about the problem of smoke from bonfires and from.
And to be fair, I think on all of these issues, it's easy to make the observation, saying what we think. I think it's going to be incredibly difficult to actually, this is what we're going to do, we're going to reduce it by X amount, this is how we're going to monitor it, and this is how, when we're going to monitor it, making it a smart objective in the action plan. I think that's going to be incredibly difficult, and that, I think, is the thing that's lacking in this document, is the real teeth to actually do it. And in 12 months' time, when it comes back to the overview and scrutiny, and we can say, right, well, these are the points that were raised, and this is what we've done, and this is the result of that action. Because I'm not sure in 12 months' time we'll know, whatever the results are, I don't think we'll really know how did we get to that point, other than big issues of what people probably aren't driving as much, people are working out, you know, the bonfires, you know, how do we measure it? And I think that's where the work needs to be done. What are we going to do? What campaigns are we going to do to reduce it?
Well,
so
perhaps we
I
can
welcome to.
I just wondered if we should do something like a survey and ask people what do they do, have a wood burning stove, and do they have a bonfire, just to get some information at the beginning.
My difficulty with all of this is that, you know, even if we measure it and monitor it and are anti it, unless we are backed by government legislation or guidance, we can't do anything about it. So basically, if we have an issue here and think there's an issue, we have to include lobbying government, effectively as part of the move, because, as I say, we can want all sorts of things through planning, but we know when we get in there, if it's not actually enshrined in legislation or in our policies, we can't enforce it at the planning level. So, something like that, which totally with you, Councillor Darcy. I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying, but if we don't have national guidance and legislation that backs up what we want to do, we're just whistling in the wind as ever, aren't we? So,
But what we've got to make sure is we get our own house in order in Waverley. Now, I don't know, we've got a large number of council properties. I haven't got a clue. Have we got any of those who've got wood burners? Might have none. There might be 500. I have absolutely no idea. It's very difficult to influence a lot of things, but we can influence what we have control of. And that's what I think it's got to be our starting point. And then all the other things are more long-term to try and influence the government, change policy. So, Councillor Forashewski.
I think that's an excellent point you made there. And I think you are absolutely spot on, absolutely. But there's 17 clouds here that we could say, well, each week or each month when comms sent out a newsletter to its residents, all residents in Waverley, that we take each one of these as a heading and then we just make people aware. But making them aware is one thing, making them change their habits is something absolutely different. So if you're going to start doing something like this, lead by example, look at our own housing stock, look at our own buildings, look at what we're all doing, and then make us the example that we can lead from. And if we're doing it correctly, then so be it. But we can't do anything to change this. All we can do is educate and promote and run campaigns to be a good borough council. But at the end of the day, unless we have legislation to back it up, then we're on a hide into nowhere, because I hate bonfires with a passion. And I know that there is things that we can do about nuisance bonfires and all the rest of it, but there's nothing to back it up. Residents have to go through enormous amounts of unpleasantness to get to the point that they stop complaining. And as I say, the planning is a great example again. There's so much we could be doing there. There's so much we should be lobbying our MPs and all the rest of it. Because if we've got raw sewage pumping out of the sewers in Cranley as we speak, I mean, what are we playing up by giving these people planning applications when the infrastructure isn't there? And it's pure madness, it really is. And make some of these people statutory consultees, so they have to have control over that. And I think we can do something there as a borough to do that, to include it. But you're absolutely right with that legislation we can do. But we can educate them. We shouldn't be put off by using comms and the residents' letters to get some of these messages across.
So I think what the point is that they need to have a comms strategy to try and tackle them, and whether it's on a monthly news,
That's it.
we don't have to make it complex or difficult.
No.
We use the existing.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really useful. Any other comments?
I have one small.
Yeah.
Comment. It was just in one of the. My notes somewhere. Basically, no, probably not. Oh yeah, on page 6 of the Clean Air Strategy, point 3.7, it says, however, some people are more likely to suffer than others because they live in private areas, which often have higher levels of air pollution. And I thought, well, it's the other way around, isn't it? It's more likely to suffer because they live in areas with higher levels of air pollution, which are often deprived areas. It's not that it's the deprived area doesn't make it have air pollution. It's the other way around. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. You're saying that housing's cheaper near to main roads, etc., and lots of other factors.
Yeah. The deprived areas are associated with air pollution, but it's not a causal effect.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
I'll change that.
Okay.
Well, it says they're more likely to suffer than others because they live in deprived areas, which often have higher levels of air pollution. So it doesn't say that
I would just say, some people
Yeah.
are more than others because they live in high level pollution areas, which are often deprived areas.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a subtle point, but I think it's.
Just a point that's come through on the chat, we're just trying to look at the pages. I think it's from Councillor Hyman basically saying to remind members that it's still under consultation until the 15th of January. So I'm sure everybody's is aware of that, but thank you, Jerry, for raising that. Any other points from around the floor? No. I mean, I say, though it may appear that we're being critical, Claire, I think the general consensus is good, really good bit of work. We just want it to be a bit better and a bit more meaty and a bit more, have some more teeth. We will try and sort out all the summary views. We'll confirm them. We'll send them through to you. I mean, the recommendation is to know to make comments on the draft air quality action plan and the draft clean air strategy, which we have done. So is everybody happy with our recommendations and views?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll get them circulated during this week. I see Jerry shaking his head, but I'm sure Jerry during executive will raise his points.
It's actually the infrastructure programme that's
being consulted
on until the 15th.
Okay, that's absolutely brilliant. So we'll put those views. We will just be one of the number of people who will give their views. Jerry, I'm sure the executive will look forward to your comments when they look at this document. I do think we can just make this just a little bit more impactful. So, but we are really grateful, Richard, to Claire. Richard, do you want a final comment before?
Yeah, look, I was just going to thank the committee for its consideration and the comments you've made, and we'll certainly take those back and discuss them with Claire and with our colleagues, and look at incorporating as many of them as possible into the report.
Brilliant. Thank you everybody for your contributions. Unless anybody's got anything else, I'll conclude the meeting.
Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Chairman, is it possible to speak to you now, as the meeting's closed?
Yeah, right, the meeting's closed, you can.
Chairman, I'm sorry, but I feel that you've been completely misled here, but in a new